It was a quiet spring evening in the suburbs. The kind of evening where kids laughed in the distance, basketballs echoed off driveways, and the setting sun cast a soft golden hue across rooftops. Nothing felt out of place. It was peaceful, normal, until it wasn't. Lena, just 13, was the kind of girl who left sunshine wherever she went. Her notebooks were full of sketches, her shelves stacked with books, and her room was a colorful storm of glitter, stickers, and handwritten dreams. She didn't know it, but that day would be the last page in her story. She had gone over to a friend's house, not far from her own, something she'd done dozens of times before. The laughter was real, the fun innocent. But something was different this time. Something dangerous had entered the picture. A gun. It wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't locked away. It wasn't handled by adults. It had been found, maybe in a drawer, maybe under a bed. And now it was in the hands of two boys, Kyle and Trey, both 14. First, it was just curiosity, a thrill, a photo snapped for social media, maybe even a dare. They didn't understand the weight of what they held. Not truly. To them, it was like holding a toy from a movie, unreal, disconnected from consequence. But reality doesn't bend for inexperience. A finger slipped, or pressed. The details blurred in the seconds that followed. All anyone remembers for sure is the loud bang, and then the silence that swallowed the room whole. Lena collapsed. There was no scream at first, just shock, just the horrifying stillness of three kids who had no idea how quickly life could end. Blood stained the floor. Kyle dropped the gun. Trey froze, and Lena wasn't moving. Someone called 911. The paramedics rushed in. Neighbors gathered. But by then, it was too late. Lena was gone. The next morning, headlines would report the unthinkable. A 13-year-old girl shot and killed. Two 14-year-old boys taken into custody. What started as an ordinary hangout turned into a criminal investigation. Grief settled like fog over the neighborhood. Her parents, broken. Her friends, speechless. The community wanted answers. Where did the gun come from? Who left it accessible? Why weren't they taught better? The questions echoed louder than the gunshot ever did. But this was only the beginning. In the weeks to come, the truth would unravel, piece by painful piece. And at the center of it all would be three children, a shattered family, and a tragedy that could have been prevented. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet night like a scream that wouldn't stop. Red and blue lights washed over the street as neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering, fearing the worst. And they were right to fear it. Inside the house, everything had changed. Lena's body was still on the floor when the paramedics arrived. Her once lively eyes were closed, her arms limp by her sides. One of the medics checked for a pulse, but the look on his face said everything before the words even came out. Kyle sat on the couch, shaking uncontrollably, his knees drawn up to his chest. His hands were stained, not just with blood, but with something heavier, the weight of guilt. Trey stood by the door, pacing, crying. "I didn't mean to," he kept repeating. "We were just messing around." Neither of them could grasp the full scope of what had happened. They were kids, just kids, but the consequences were very real. Police officers stepped in minutes later, careful but serious. The gun, a 9mm handgun, had been left on the floor. Officer Daniels picked it up with gloved hands. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Kyle hesitated. Trey stammered. Finally, one of them said it belonged to a family member. A gun kept for protection but not locked away. That detail would matter later. Lena's parents arrived at the scene soon after. Her mother collapsed the moment she saw the stretcher. No, not my baby. Not my Lena." Her father held her tightly, trying to stay upright as the world beneath them crumbled. There are no words that can ever prepare someone for that moment. At the police station, the boys were questioned separately. Each had a different version of what happened, but both agreed on one thing. The gun wasn't supposed to go off. It was supposed to be a joke, a secret, a moment of thrill. Not this. But the law didn't care about intent in the same way grief did. The next morning, The district attorney's office announced that both boys would face charges, including involuntary manslaughter. The public was stunned. Some were angry, others confused. Could you charge a 14-year-old for something like this? Could you not? Debates erupted on local news and social media. Parents feared for their own children. Schools organized emergency assemblies. Gun safety programs suddenly became urgent again. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Lena's bedroom remained untouched. Her diary still open on her desk, yesterday's shoes still by the door. Her story had ended. But the story of the two boys, and how this tragedy would shape the rest of their lives, was only just beginning. 3 days had passed, but it felt like a lifetime. The neighborhood was still in mourning. Candles flickered on the sidewalk outside Lena's home, surrounded by flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes. Children passed by with their parents, holding tight to hands they normally let go of. No one wanted to forget Lena, but no one knew how to speak about what had happened either. Inside a juvenile detention center, Kyle sat in a small, cold room, staring at the table in front of him. He hadn't spoken much since his arrest. He kept seeing it, Lena's face, the moment just before the shot, the way the laughter stopped so suddenly. He wished he could turn back time. He wished it had been a dream. Across town, Trey was also in custody. He hadn't slept. The echoes of that gunshot haunted every second. He replayed it over and over, trying to figure out what he could have done differently. Maybe he should have told Kyle to put the gun away. Maybe he shouldn't have brought it out at all. Maybe, their parents were shattered too. Sitting across from detectives, they tried to explain how it happened, how boys so young got access to a deadly weapon. Kyle's father admitted the gun was his. He'd kept it for safety, never imagining it would fall into the wrong hands, let alone his own son's. Trey's mother broke down in tears. "He didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said. "He's just a child." But the law had already taken its course. The two boys were formally charged with involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and unlawful possession of a firearm. They would be tried in juvenile court, but the implications were serious. A conviction could mean time in a juvenile facility, and a record that would follow them for years. Lena's family, meanwhile, was left with nothing but grief. Her mother hadn't returned to work. Her father barely spoke. They spent hours in her room, touching her things, rereading her diary entries, trying to feel close to her again. There was one entry dated just a week before her death. "I feel safe when I'm with my friends. I think the world is mostly good." The words were almost too painful to read. At school, Lena's desk sat empty. Her teachers left it untouched, a small bouquet placed on top. Counselors were brought in. Some kids cried. Others were just quiet, confused. How could someone their age, someone they knew, be gone? And how could two more be locked away for it? A vigil was held that Friday night. Hundreds gathered with candles in hand. Lena's favorite song played softly in the background as people took turns sharing memories. One of her best friends, Maya, stepped up to the mic, voice trembling. "She was the nicest person I knew. She didn't deserve this. None of us did." The crowd stood in silence, holding their lights high. Somewhere, far from that circle of warmth, Kyle and Trey sat in separate cells, both wondering the same thing. Could anyone ever forgive them? By the time the court date arrived, the story had already rippled far beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations ran daily updates, while social media filled with heated opinions. Some called for compassion. "They're just kids." Others demanded accountability. "A girl is dead." But for those at the center of the tragedy, none of the noise made it any easier. The courthouse was quiet that morning. Reporters stood behind barriers, cameras poised. Inside, Lena's parents sat side by side in the front row, her mother gripping a small photo of her daughter, the one where she's laughing with a ribbon in her hair. When Kyle was brought in, his shoulders were hunched, eyes red from nights without rest. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a boy who hadn't seen daylight in too long. Trey entered moments later. His expression was blank, but his fingers trembled as he sat down next to his attorney. Neither boy made eye contact with Lena's family. They couldn't. The judge entered the room and everyone rose. What followed wasn't dramatic like in the movies. It was quiet, formal, heavy. The prosecution laid out the facts. The unsecured gun, the recklessness, the irreversible consequence of a single action. They emphasized that while no one intended harm, lives were still lost. Lena's literally, and the boys in another way entirely. The defense did not argue what happened. There was no denial. Instead, they pleaded for understanding, presenting the boys as victims too, of neglect, poor judgment, and a society that hadn't protected any of them properly. They are not monsters, Trey's lawyer said. They are children who made a terrible mistake. One they will carry forever. Lena's mother took the stand next. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each sentence. She spoke about Lena's dreams, her laughter, the silence in the house now. She looked directly at the boys. "You took my daughter from me," she said. "And I know you didn't mean to, but meaning doesn't change the fact that she's gone. It doesn't change the way her room still smells like her, or how her cat waits at the door every night." Her words hung in the air like smoke. The court adjourned for the day, and the judge ordered a full psychological evaluation for both boys before sentencing. The final decision would take weeks. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions no one answered. Inside a parked car, Lena's father sat in silence, hands gripping the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. No verdict would bring Lena back. No sentence would undo that moment. That night, Kyle cried for the first time in weeks. Not because he was scared of punishment, but because the sound of the gun, Lena's voice, and her fall kept replaying in his mind like a loop he couldn't break. Trey stared at the ceiling of his cell, whispering apologies to a girl who would never hear them. The world kept turning, but for 3 families, time had stopped, and no one knew. Long before the tragedy, before the sirens, before courtrooms and funerals, they were just kids. Lena met Kyle and Trey during the first week of middle school. She had transferred from another district, shy but curious. Kyle had offered her a seat at lunch when no one else did. Trey made her laugh with silly impressions. They weren't best friends, but they were close enough to be comfortable. Close enough to trust. In the months that followed, they shared hallways, inside jokes, and study notes. Lena was the glue in many circles. A calm presence, someone who didn't judge or tease. Kyle had always admired her for that. Trey liked that she never rolled her eyes at his jokes, even the bad ones. But as the school year dragged on, things started to shift. Kyle had been struggling at home. His parents fought constantly, and his older brother had moved out suddenly after an arrest. The tension spilled into school, and Kyle grew quieter, angrier. He stopped turning in homework. He started skipping class. Trey, on the other hand, was trying to prove himself. He didn't have much. His mom worked 2 jobs. His dad had left years ago. He hated being seen as weak, and sometimes he tried too hard to fit in with older kids in the neighborhood. Kids who talked tough, showed off knives, sometimes guns. Lena noticed. She mentioned it in her journal once. "I feel like Trey is changing, and Kyle looks tired all the time. I want to help, but I don't know how. Maybe I'm not enough." The gun, it turned out, had been hidden in Kyle's house for years. His father had bought it for protection after a burglary on their street. It wasn't locked away. It wasn't even hidden well. Just in a closet behind an old box of tools. Kyle found it one afternoon while looking for a charger. He didn't take it right away. He stared at it, touched it, left it alone. But the idea stuck. Not the idea of hurting anyone, that was never part of it. But the thrill, the control, the way his heart pounded just from holding it. He told Trey about it a week later. Trey wanted to see it. "You won't believe it," Kyle had said. "It's heavy. Real." Trey dared him to bring it out. So he did. On that final day, they weren't planning anything. It was boredom, mixed with bad judgment and a desperate desire to impress. Lena was there by coincidence, not invitation. She had come over to return a book she'd borrowed. Kyle told her to stay, said they'd hang out for a bit. She laughed when she saw the 2 boys acting dramatic. "What are you even doing?" she teased. That was the last thing she said. The gun was in Trey's hand. Kyle reached for it. They argued, but playfully, or so they thought. Then someone moved too fast. The finger twitched, and the room went silent. In the end, it wasn't hate or cruelty. It wasn't planned. It was the fatal collision of curiosity, carelessness, and a world that didn't teach them enough about what a trigger could do. The tragedy didn't begin with the show. 6 weeks passed since that devastating day. Leaves had begun to fall, painting the streets in shades of amber and rust, a stark contrast to the dark cloud still hanging over the community. Inside the courtroom, tension buzzed like static. Today was sentencing day. Kyle and Trey sat quietly beside their attorneys, their expressions unreadable. Neither wore handcuffs. Juvenile court did things differently, but the weight of what was coming felt heavier than any chains. Lena's parents were seated in the same place they always were. Her mother wore black, her hand never leaving the photo of Lena she carried to every hearing. Her father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with silver streaks in her hair, began the session with a heavy sigh. "We are here not just for punishment," she said, "but for reckoning with a system, with parenting, with a culture of silence around guns and children." She reviewed the psychological evaluations. Both boys had shown remorse, deep, consistent remorse. They were not considered violent, not a danger to others, but they had made a deadly mistake, and it came with a price. Then came the moment everyone had waited for. The room held its breath. "Kyle and Trey," the judge began, "you are hereby sentenced to remain in juvenile custody until the age of 18, with mandatory participation in trauma counseling, restorative justice programs, and education on gun violence." There was a pause. "But this is not just a punishment," she continued. "It is also a chance, a very rare chance for redemption." Gasps echoed softly. Some had expected worse. Others thought it too lenient. But for Lena's parents, it was never about revenge. Lena's mother stood once more, trembling but firm. "I don't want another child to be lost like mine," she said. "I pray that this never happens again, and that the boys remember Lena every day they wake up, because we don't get to wake up with her anymore." Kyle cried quietly into his hands. Trey looked away, his jaw twitching as he fought to hold it together. The press outside exploded with headlines. Teen boys sentenced in accidental shooting death. Judge offers second chance in tragic case. Family calls for change after daughter's death. But the courtroom emptied in silence. In the car on the way back, Lena's father finally spoke. "It's not justice," he said. "It's not peace, but maybe it's a beginning." That night, in their separate cells, the boys lay awake. Kyle wrote in a journal they'd given him in therapy. "I miss her. I don't know why I got a second chance and she didn't, but I won't waste it." Trey sat staring at the ceiling again. In his hands, he held a copy of Lena's obituary. He'd read it every night for weeks. And somewhere across town, Lena's room remained untouched. Her cat still curled on her bed. Her books still lined the shelf. And on her desk, a new candle flickered beside the words she once wrote. "The world is mostly good." Somewhere, somehow, hope still glowed, fragile but alive. In the weeks following the sentencing, the town felt different. Quieter, heavier. It wasn't just grief. It was awareness, a shared understanding that something had broken, and no one could pretend otherwise. The school held assemblies, not just about gun safety, but about emotional health, friendship, and asking for help. Teachers, once focused only on grades and behavior, began watching more closely, noticing the quiet kids, the tired eyes, the ones who always stayed behind after the bell. In history class, Lena's empty seat remained untouched. Her name was still on the attendance sheet, but the teacher paused slightly before skipping over it. Maya, her best friend, had once drawn doodles in the margins of Lena's notebooks. Now, she carried one of those notebooks in her backpack every day, even though she never opened it. Parents began locking up their weapons, some for the first time. Others gave theirs up entirely. Conversations once too uncomfortable to have were now taking place at dinner tables, at town halls, even between strangers in line at the grocery store. "We didn't protect them," one father said at a PTA meeting. "Not Lena, not the boys, not any of them." At the juvenile center, Kyle and Trey adjusted to a life they never imagined for themselves. The daily routines were rigid: wake up, school, therapy, group sessions, chores, lights out. It was nothing like home, and yet it slowly became their new reality. In group counseling, Trey was quiet at first. But one day, after hearing another boy talk about his sister's overdose, he spoke up. "I hurt someone too," he said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to, but I did." Kyle, across the room, kept his head down, tears threatening to surface. Later that night, Trey and Kyle sat at the edge of the recreation yard. The sky above was clear, stars blinking faintly through the tall fences. "Do you think she'd hate us?" Trey asked. Kyle didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I think she'd be mad, but I don't think she'd want us to give up." It was the first time they'd spoken about Lena since the trial. Meanwhile, Lena's parents had started something unexpected, a foundation in her name, the Lena Bright Foundation for Youth and Gun Safety. It wasn't about politics. It was about education, empathy, and prevention. They visited schools, spoke to lawmakers. They turned their grief into movement. But at home, the silence still hurt. Her room remained untouched. The family cat had grown thin, curling on her bed every evening, waiting. And in Lena's journal, on the final page, her last entry still echoed in her mother's mind. "Sometimes I think life is made of tiny choices. One good one can change everything." One choice had taken her away. Now, maybe many good ones could honor her. It had been 4 months since the shooting. For months since Lena's laugh echoed in the hallways. Since her parents heard her voice. Since Kyle and Trey had seen anything beyond gray walls and barbed fences. Time inside juvenile detention passed differently, slower, quieter. The days were marked not by clocks, but by routines, reflections, and the weight of memory. One afternoon, during a writing exercise in therapy, the boys were asked to write letters they'd never send. Kyle stared at the blank paper for nearly 10 minutes. Then, slowly, he began to write. "Dear Lena, there are no words that feel big enough for what I did. I know you're gone. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But if somehow your voice still exists somewhere, I want you to know that I am sorry. Not just for the accident, but for the decisions, for the carelessness, for treating something deadly like it was a game. You were kind. You were good. You didn't deserve to die. I see your face every time I close my eyes. That will never go away, and maybe it shouldn't. But I promise, if there's anything left of me that can do good, I'll find it. For you, Kyle." Trey's letter was shorter, but just as raw. "Lena, I wish I had said something. I wish I had stopped it. You trusted us and we failed you. I think about your smile, how you always made things feel light. We brought the dark in. I will carry this forever. I'm sorry." Neither boy knew the letters would ever be read. But Kyle's counselor, after a long conversation, reached out to Lena's parents. She asked, carefully, respectfully, if they'd be willing to receive the letters. Took days for them to decide. Lena's mother finally said, "We'll read them together." That night, they sat in the living room, hands clasped, the weight of their daughter's absence between them. Her photo smiled down from the mantel. They read in silence. Then again, and again, there were tears. Not just for the loss, but for the unimaginable grief those boys now carried, too. Later, Lena's father placed the letters in the drawer of her desk. "We'll never get her back," he said softly. "But maybe this is part of what she left behind. A lesson no one should have had to learn this way." Meanwhile, in detention, Kyle and Trey continued therapy, schoolwork, and long nights of thinking. They didn't know the letters had been delivered. They didn't expect a reply. But something had shifted. The act of writing them had opened something in both boys. The beginning of accountability, not imposed by law, but born from within. Outside, the world moved on. Cars honked, children laughed, people rushed to work. But for two boys and one grieving family, time still circled the same moment. And yet, for the first time, healing didn't feel impossible. It just felt slow and very, very quiet. News of Lena's story and the boys' sentencing had slowly begun to fade from headlines, replaced by newer stories and louder tragedies. But in her town, the impact hadn't faded. It had only deepened. At Lena's former school, her name had become part of a new conversation. The principal launched a student-led group called Lena's Voice, focused on peer safety, emotional support, and speaking up when something felt wrong. Posters lined the walls with her favorite quote, scrawled in soft cursive. "One good choice can change everything." Maya, Lena's best friend, led the first meeting. Her voice shook, but she stood tall. She believed in people, Maya said, even when we didn't believe in ourselves. That's what this group is for, to keep believing. Even after everything. Students began opening up. One boy talked about how his older brother kept a gun under his mattress. Another admitted he'd thought about hurting himself, but didn't know who to talk to. That room became a safe place, one that had never existed before. Lena's story had made something clear. Silence could be deadly. Meanwhile, Lena's parents continued their work through the foundation. They met with other families, visited schools, and helped pass a local ordinance requiring safe firearm storage in homes with children. It wasn't enough to erase the past, nothing ever would be, but it gave their grief a purpose, a direction. "We couldn't save our daughter," Lena's mother said during a radio interview, "but maybe she can still save others." In juvenile detention, Kyle was making progress. Slowly, painfully, he volunteered to speak during a group session about accountability. "We were just trying to look cool," he said. "That's the truth. I wish I could say it was more complicated. But it wasn't. We were stupid, and it cost someone everything." Trey, sitting nearby, nodded. "We didn't grow up learning what respect meant. For people, for life, for danger." Their honesty stunned the group. Later that week, a counselor told Kyle that his letter had been read by Lena's parents. No anger, no promises, just that they'd read it. Kyle sat in silence for a long time. "They didn't have to," he whispered. "They didn't owe me anything." That night, he wrote again. Not to Lena this time, but to himself. "You can't undo what you did, but you can build something better with what's left. You owe her that. You owe them all that." Outside the center, fall had turned to winter. The wind was sharp, the skies gray. But inside, in slow and quiet ways, change had begun to bloom. Snow fell softly that December, blanketing the town in a silence that felt almost sacred. The streets were quiet, lit with warm strings of holiday lights. But in Lena's home, the season brought no celebration. Her absence was louder during holidays. Her stocking still hung on the mantel, untouched. Her favorite mug, the one with chipped stars around the rim, sat in the back of the kitchen cabinet. Her mother couldn't bring herself to move it. Her father had built a small bench for their front porch, a place where they could sit in the cold and feel like they were still close to her somehow. "I thought this would get easier," her mother said one evening, "but the quiet just gets heavier." In the juvenile center, holidays were muted. No decorations, no visitors beyond scheduled family time, no music unless approved. Still, there were small gestures, cookies with dinner, extra library time, and staff who offered warmer words. Kyle sat by the frosted window on Christmas morning, watching flurries dance against the sky. He remembered how Lena loved snow, how she would run outside without a coat, just to catch flakes on her eyelashes. Trey was nearby, sketching in a notebook the facility gave him. On the page was a drawing. 3 figures under a snowy tree, one of them holding a cat. He didn't say who it was, but Kyle knew. Later that afternoon, they received envelopes. Holiday messages from community members who had attended one of Lena's memorials. Some of the notes were short. Others were longer, uncertain, and complex. One read, "I don't know how to feel about what happened. I still feel anger, but I also see that you're just boys. I hope you grow. I hope you do better." For her. Another simply said, "She wouldn't want hate to win. Kyle read his letters twice. Then he folded them, put them in the same envelope that held Lena's obituary, and placed it under his mattress like something sacred. That night, during journaling hour, he wrote, "Grief doesn't move in straight lines. It circles, it dips, but every time it passes, I try to stand up taller. I think Lena would want that." Trey shared his drawing with their counselor. It was the first time he'd opened up in art therapy. "She loved cats," he said. "I didn't even like them before. Now I think about hers all the time. Still waiting for her." The counselor smiled softly. "You remember the details. That means something." Meanwhile, Lena's parents prepared to host their first community gathering in the new year. It would be called Lena's Light, a candlelit walk in her honor, ending at the park where she used to swing after school. "It's not about healing," her father said. "It's about remembering and choosing something better. Every day." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, in the stillness, the smallest pieces of hope began to take shape. Quiet as snowflakes, delicate but real. The night of January 14th was cold, the kind of cold that clings to your skin and settles in your chest. But still, they came. Families, friends, teachers, strangers. Hundreds of people gathered at the school parking lot, bundled in coats and scarves, holding candles that flickered gently in the wind. At the front, Lena's parents stood together, hand in hand, holding one single lantern. A paper one, soft and white. They called the event Lena's Light. Not a protest, not a vigil, a walk of remembrance and promise. A way to reclaim something. As the crowd began the slow walk toward the park, where Lena once swung between trees, her laughter echoing over with chips and grass, a quiet chant rose from somewhere near the front. For Lena, for love, for change. The glow of candles lit the path like stars on earth. Maya walked with her parents, Lena's journal pressed to her chest. Teachers held signs that read, "Lock it up, speak it out, save a life." Half a mile away, behind fences and watchtowers, Kyle watched the footage later that night on a staff member's phone. The event had been streamed live by a local news channel. No one spoke in the rec room. Even the staff stood still, listening. Trey sat beside him, silent. They watched as Lena's mother stepped up to the microphone at the edge of the park, candlelight dancing across her face. "We don't walk tonight because we've healed," she said. "We walk because we still hurt. But we choose to hurt forward, to make something out of our pain, to build something where there used to be nothing." She held up the lantern. This was Lena's. She made it in art class. She said it would help guide her dreams. Then, without a word, she released it into the sky. The lantern floated upward, swaying, spinning slowly as it rose above the crowd. One by one, more lanterns joined it, glowing softly as they drifted into the night. Kyle stood. He couldn't sit anymore. "I remember that," he whispered. "She made it the day I forgot my homework. She let me copy hers." Trey gave a sad laugh. "She helped me pass biology. She made it fun." Neither boy spoke after that. They just stood, watching the sky on the screen, full of light. Back at the park, Maya took the mic for a final message. "We can't bring Lena back," she said, voice cracking. "But we can carry her forward. And we will." The crowd stood in silence. Some cried. Some simply closed their eyes. The night ended with a circle, hands linked, candles burning low. A moment of shared stillness. And above them, the lanterns kept drifting, carried by wind, watched by those who remembered, and those who would never forget. Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted into the grass outside the detention facility, and the walls that once felt like a tomb now let in more sunlight through narrow windows. Time hadn't healed everything, but it had shifted something. Kyle had grown taller. His voice had changed. His eyes were still heavy, but there was something new behind them, a steadiness. Trey too had changed. His temper, once sharp and reactive, had dulled into introspection. He now spoke more in therapy, sometimes volunteering to help younger detainees with schoolwork. They were no longer the same boys who had picked up that gun. One morning, the warden called Kyle into his office. Waiting inside was a woman he didn't recognize at first, until she smiled gently and said, "I'm Lena's aunt." Kyle froze. His throat closed. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said softly. I asked if I could meet you. I've read your letters. I needed to see your face." He could barely speak. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because I wanted to believe there was still something human here. That Lena's story didn't just end with her death." They sat for almost an hour. Kyle answered her questions. He told her about the moment it happened, about the weight of the silence after, about the guilt, and about Lena, how kind she'd always been, even when they didn't deserve it. When the meeting ended, she placed a small object in his hand, a folded paper star. "Lena used to make these," she said. "She'd leave them around the house like reminders that even small things can matter." Kyle clutched it like it was fragile. Meanwhile, Trey was accepted into a creative writing program within the center. For one of his assignments, he wrote a fictional short story about a boy who lost everything and found redemption in a garden he planted with his own hands. "I think," he told his counselor, "I'm ready to do something that isn't just about what I did, but who I can be." At home, Lena's parents continued their outreach. They traveled to other towns now. Her father spoke on gun safety panels. Her mother worked with state officials to pass what would be known as Lena's Law, legislation requiring firearm safety courses for any household with children. It wasn't justice, but it was something. At school, the Lena's Voice Club had doubled in size. Students wrote essays, created art, hosted community events. Maya organized a fundraiser to build a small memorial bench in the school garden. On it, engraved in soft silver, were Lena's words, "One good choice can change everything." And on the first day of spring, students planted tulip bulbs around the bench, each one a promise, each one a beginning. By summer, the tulips had bloomed. Dozens of bright colors danced in the school garden, surrounding the silver bench engraved with Lena's words. Students came there often now to reflect, to talk, to remember. Some just sat in silence. Others left notes in a small jar labeled for Lena. Handwritten messages of apology, grief, and sometimes hope. Maya visited every Friday. She'd sit for an hour, reading from Lena's journal or bringing fresh flowers. One day, she found a folded piece of paper under the bench. Not one of her own groups. It was from someone anonymous. It said, "I used to carry a gun. I don't anymore. Because of her." Back at the juvenile facility, Kyle and Trey were nearing the end of their sentences. They had each served over a year marked by transformation neither of them could have imagined. It wasn't forgiveness they expected. They knew they couldn't undo what happened, but both boys had chosen to face it every day. Kyle began writing letters, not to Lena's family, but to other kids across the state. With help from counselors and nonprofit organizations, his words were shared in classrooms and youth centers. "It takes 2 seconds to ruin a life," he wrote. "Sometimes more than one. If you think you're invincible, you're not. I thought I was until I wasn't. Please, stop and think." Trey's drawings were used in a statewide campaign on gun safety awareness. He never signed his name, but he signed every piece with a small sketch of a cat, Lena's. Their names were still in the court records. The tragedy was still in the headlines when anniversaries came around. But now, their faces appeared next to stories not of violence, but of change. One morning, Kyle stood before a room of students on a monitored video call. His hands trembled as he spoke. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said, "but I did. And for the rest of my life, I'll live with that. What I can do now is try to make sure no one else makes the same mistake." There was a long pause. Then one student raised their hand and asked, "Do you think Lena would forgive you?" Kyle's voice caught. "I don't know," he said, "but I think she'd want me to try to become someone worth forgiving." Outside, the world turned. The flowers grew taller. The bench stayed warm under the sun. And inside that small garden, a girl's memory continued to bloom, not just in sorrow, but in action. Her story, painful as it was, had become something more. A warning, a legacy, a light. 1 year later, the anniversary of Lena's death fell on a quiet Sunday. There were no speeches this time, no media vans or flashing cameras. Just people, families, students, a few teachers, and two young men, newly released, standing side by side on the edge of the school garden. Kyle and Trey had been granted supervised community service as part of their final re-entry program. Not everyone was ready to see them back, and some never would be. But Lena's parents, after months of soul-searching, heartache, and counseling, had chosen a different path. They had invited them, not to forgive, Lena's mother said quietly to the school principal, but to acknowledge, to witness what can still grow. The garden was in full bloom. New flowers had been planted, sunflowers, wild poppies, and Lena's favorite, lavender. At the center was the bench, newly polished. Below the engraved quote was a new line, recently added, "This space is for healing, for everyone." Kyle approached the bench first. In his hand, he carried the same paper star Lena's aunt had given him months earlier. He placed it gently beneath the flowers. "I still see her face," he whispered, "every time I close my eyes." Trey stood beside him, quiet, holding a sketchbook filled with portraits. The last page was a drawing of Lena, from memory, but drawn with care. Not perfect, but honest. A few students from the Lena's voice group approached, Maya among them. She didn't speak at first, just looked at the boys, her expression unreadable. Then she held out her hand. To Trey, to Kyle. A long pause, and then they shook. Not absolution, not friendship, but maybe the first stone laid in a long, uncertain road towards something better. Later, the group gathered to plant a tree. A small one, a sapling. They named it Lena's tree, not to mark where something ended, but where something new began. As the last shovel of earth was pressed down, Lena's father spoke one final time. She was 13. She had dreams, laughter, notebooks full of song lyrics. We carry her not because she's gone, but because she matters. Still, the wind rustled through the leaves. A single lavender petal floated to the ground. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Kyle and Trey remained, watching the branches sway, listening to the quiet, feeling something they hadn't in a long time, a second chance. They knew the road ahead would be long. There would always be people who saw only their worst moment. But there would also be those who remembered their efforts, their regret, their growth, and what they chose to do after the unthinkable. Because Lena's life, though short, had left a mark, not just in grief, but in what came next. A garden, a law, a voice, a legacy, a light that wouldn't go out.